So hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome finally to the Terms of Two conference actions. I'm Wendy Chun, professor, and for my sins, but for not much longer, chair of MCM. And I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have this conference finally start. It should be a wonderful 2.5 days together. For all of you tweeting, the hashtag is Terms of Media. This evening, I'll explain very briefly the questions driving this conference, as well as its history, and then introduce our really wonderful keynote speakers. The concept behind this conference is quite simple: to interrogate the terms of media, to investigate how media set the terms, or not, of how we live, relate, communicate, and organize, while also exploring the terms we place on media, while also, of course, outlining various terms of media. By terms of media, though, we don't simply mean keywords, but also the phrases and phases, the terms and terminations of media. So most pressingly, we'll ask, why terms? Why now? Why is this the term for terms? What has happened to make terms or keywords so prominent? Clearly, one answer to this is the dominance of search engines. But what does it mean to search for media? And why now are so many disciplines in search of media? And this is something clearly that Renee Ridgway's dissertation will all make clear for us shortly. Now, the concept of the conference started, as so many do, in a rather hazy buzz of good company with Madoka Takashiro and Götz Bachmann in Lüneburg, Germany. Because, to be quite honest, you have to be inebriated. You have to take leave of your senses to even conceive of hosting a conference. So a piece of professorly advice to all students out there: whatever you do, don't drink. Just say no. Okay. Fittingly, the idea hatched that night was to create a conference or a series of conferences bridging German media theory, whatever that beast is, and trust me, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole, and Anglo-American media theory. As many of you know, we started in Lüneburg last June with a wonderful conference hosted by Timon and Götz and organized by the CDC and DCRL, in particular Paul Feigelfeld and Sam Gupta. And fittingly, that conference in Germany was focused on nouns. This one in America is focused on verbs, actions, structure, organize, remain, work, animate, communicate, forecast, and mediate. And we've brought together not only the most interesting people working on these ideas, and each of the speakers themselves could be keynotes, we've paired them in such a way that we expect sparks to fly, sparks of recognition, care, and even contention. Which brings me to the keynote speakers for tonight. But before we get there, I'd like to thank some organizations and people. First, our generous sponsors, the Malcolm S. Forbes Center for the Center for Culture and Media Studies, the Humanities Initiative, the Kogut Center for the Humanities. Thank you, Amanda Anderson and your crew, for hosting the next few days. The Creative Arts Council and Arts Initiative. Today's keynote is part of Arttober, a month-long festival of the arts here at Brown. The Charles K. Culver Lectureship Fund, the Department of German Studies, and the Department of Modern Culture and Media. Thank you all for making this possible. I'd also like to thank the student workers, Jen Vincent, our special events coordinator, Liza Hebert and Susan McNeil, who are here, even though I promised them I would finally organize a conference for which they would not have to work overtime. I owe them Fluvogs. We will go on International Fluvog Day. I will buy you beautiful shoes. And of course, Thomas Pringle, who has been absolutely fantastic. This could not have happened without you, Thomas. So on to tonight's events. So the idea for tonight's keynote was inspired in part by a comment that Armin, where are you, Armin? Armin, how the hell do you pronounce your last name? There's a reason in Germany I didn't say anything German, yes. Okay, Bervengen. Okay. So a comment that Armin, who won't say his last name, made at the end of Terms of Media 2. So at the end of that conference, he asked, what do you do with the terms of media? You can test them, you work around them, you extend them. So today we have before us two of the great extenders, Marcel Mars and Rick Prelinger. And I'll introduce them both together, and they'll speak in succession. So Marcel Mars is one of the founders of the Multimedia Institute, MI2, and Club Mama in Zagreb, both at the turn of the century. It gives me such joy to say turn of the century, and it means something different than what I grew up with. So he initiated the GNU GPL publishing label EgoBoo.bits in 2000. In 2004, he started skill sharing, informal meetings of technical enthusiasts at MAMA. And in 2007, Nothing Will Happen, a series of regional hacker gatherings. Did nothing happen? No. Okay, perfect. Okay. So Mars started his research ruling class studies at the Van Eyck Institute in 2011-2012, which he continued at the Akademie Schloss Solitude, which is exactly as it sounds, a castle in the middle of nowhere in Germany. And since spring 2015, he has been a PhD student at Leuphana University Lunenburg in the DCRL. The public library, which he will talk about today, was established in 2012 to develop socio-technical infrastructures and to invigorate, again, historical instruments for universal access to knowledge. Mars also developed software, a Calibre plugin, Let's Share Books, and related server infrastructure. Next will be Rick Prelinger. Rick Prelinger is an archivist, writer, and filmmaker. He founded Prelinger Archives, at first a collection of advertising, educational, and industrial films that was acquired by the Library of Congress in 2002, now a working collection of some 13,000 amateur and home movies. He has partnered with Internet Archive to make over 6,000 films from Prelinger Archives available online for free viewing, downloading, and reuse. His feature-length 2004 film, Panorama Ephemera, depicting the conflicted landscapes of 20th century America, played in venues across the world. His 18 participatory urban history events using archival film have occurred in San Francisco, Oakland, Detroit, and coming this autumn, Los Angeles. And his 2013 film, No More Road Trips, is currently and appropriately traveling on the festival circuit. He is co-founder of Prelinger Library, an appropriation-friendly private research library open to the public, located in downtown San Francisco. He's a board member of Internet Archive and associate professor of film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So please join me in welcoming Marcel Mars.
Okay. Thank you all. I'll start. We started our public library journey by a simple proposal. A public library is free access to knowledge for every member of society, a librarian, library catalog. And then with books ready to be shared, meticulously cataloged, everyone is a librarian. And when everyone is a librarian, library is everywhere. We came out with that proposal following the Big Promise launch back in the 19th century after the bourgeois revolution. And that promise says, people are equal. What made that promise historically important, which from today's perspective does not sound as conceptually very demanding concept, is that desired equality would be part of the political project of establishment and governance of that very equality. Achieving that goal is not easy, but at least most of the bourgeois of the time agreed access to knowledge is minimal requirement for that new society to build. Some of them thought of access to knowledge as the way how the non-educated, violent working class will learn how to become a good citizens and then behave and not lead the new society into the wave of chaos once again. Bourgeois didn't need the chaos just after the royals learned their lesson through the revolution and then, if not dead, calm down for a while, ready to negotiate the new power configurations. Others of that time thought of the access to knowledge in the true spirit of enlightenment, so that access to knowledge for every member of society should bring to the humankind more of encyclopedias, dictionaries of philosophy, more people like Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, and more emancipation for people, because people are equal. Most of the time, promises, thoughts, concepts come with its own limits, scope. We can also imagine that as borders. A kind of selective, permeable, porous membrane configured to allow certain kinds of matter and not to allow other kinds. When not for liquids and chemicals, but for people, ideas, and capital, it is these rules of filtering and regulation that are a perfect example of political instrument. I'm sorry for using a vocabulary of biology. I know exactly what is playing with fire triggers here. That promise, people are equal, is a political instrument whose rate of passage depends on pressure, concentration, and temperature of the people being filtered and regulated. That promise, a border, a membrane, a political instrument, is of course not only filtering and regulating physical dimension, only geographical one, but it functions via imaginary, conceptual, administrative, legal, and recently more and more network-based, network protocol-based dimensions. But more about that later. People are equal as a guiding principle and ideal was always about solidarity, organization, and struggle for the ones from other side of the membrane. Back in the 19th century, for the ones not owning any property, who had only their labor to sell to survive, women, people of color, immigrants, indigenous people, LGBT movement. As said, it took a long time, solidarity, organization, and struggle for all of them to get the right amount of pressure, concentration, and temperature to pass that membrane of a promise, filter, and regulation that we people are all equal. These same struggles are not over, and the new ones are started. Our 19th century promise was born after the collapse of ancient regime, which ended up in the unbearable unjust, which could be only turned upside down once again. In What Was Revolutionary About the French Revolution, Robert Darnton considers how the collective experience of a complete collapse of the social order looks like. I'll quote here. You will read it with me. In 1789, the French had to confront the collapse of a whole social order. The world that they defined retrospectively as the ancient regime, and to find some new order in the chaos surrounding them. They experienced reality as something that could be destroyed and reconstructed, and they faced seemingly limitless possibilities, both for good and evil, for raising a utopia and for falling back into tyranny. In the dictionaries of the time, the word revolution was said to derive from the verb to revolve, and was defined as the return of the planet or a star to the same point from which it parted. French political vocabulary spread no further than the narrow circle of the feudal elite in Versailles. The citizens, revolutionaries, had to invent new words, concepts, almost an entire new language in order to describe the revolution that had taken place. They began with the vocabulary of time and space. If my French is any better, I would tell you more new names of the months than just Thermidor, for example. It was an adoption of the whole new calendar, with decimalization of the time of a day, decimalization of currency, and for the space, they introduced the metric system. Gram became unit of mass, and if I'm only little bit better in like a stand-up comedy, I would make a joke of the imperial system you use here. In Paris, 1,400 streets were given new names. Every reminder of the tyranny of the monarchy was erased. The revolutionaries even changed their names and surnames. Leroy or Levoq, commonly used until then, were changed to Leloy or Liberté. To address someone out of respect with vous was forbidden by a resolution passed on 24 Brumaire year 2. Vous was replaced with tu, because people are equal. The watchwords liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, brotherhood were built through literacy, new epistemologies, classifications, declarations, standards, reason, and rationality. What first comes to our mind about the revolution will never again be the return of a planet or a star to the same point from which it departed. The revolution bootstraps itself. This revolution is the foundation lying down on the left side of a dream and struggle of a public library. But public library needed another utopian dream for the balance on the right side of its name. And that side is a strange kind of utopia of an epistemological kind. There is a very certain kind of optimism that we will find a way to formalize language, come up with the symbols and notations, rules of these manipulations, which will bring not just hermeneutic consistency to the text being analyzed, written and read, but to carry on that comprehensiveness to the collections of text and annotations of collections of texts and collections of annotations of collections of texts, and you can just go further and further with that. In my favorite book on libraries, Paper Machines, Markus Krajewski led us through the journey of inventing the index card catalog. From Konrad Gessner's Bibliotheca Universalis, Leibniz's proposal for universal library during his tenure at the Wolfenbüttel Library in the, excuse my Germany, in the late 17th century, to Gottfried van Swieten's catalog of the Viennese court library. Via Melville Dewey and his decimal system of classification, and even more interesting for me, Paul Otlet, who established fascinating Mundaneum with around 18 million index cards on a wide range of topics. One at that time could even subscribe to the Mundaneum, so, and get the response by email, so it is probably the easiest to imagine Mundaneum as a very, very slow Wikipedia with requests and responses being transmitted via regular mail. But if you know about the network protocols, that's pretty much, at least it could be done on an April Fool if you follow the /.org. Never mind. There was a time when people dreamed big, and few of these dreams established itself as the foundational values of our societies today. One of them is public library, an institution no one really questioned through almost the whole 20th century. There were some evil people during the war in the 90s in Croatia, where I come from, who would throw away books because these books wouldn't fit their fascist worldview. But not even evil people would question if public library should exist. Paul Otlet's best friend Henri Lafontaine dreamed about the world as a political project where all people will be equal and live in peace. That dream led to the establishment of League of Nations and later United Nations. The 2 world wars and the century full of wars didn't really convince many that that's the one easily achieved. I'm sure in this room, this story so far triggered quite few alarms of a critique of a universalism. I like to think of myself not being very naive, especially when it comes to politics and technology. I also don't want to start a long digression on universalism, so let me say only a few things. I think that thinking about the universalism can be a process where the experience and the voice of oppressed and marginalized is, I think that thinking about the this is the hard one. I think that thinking about the universalism can be a process where the experience and the voice of oppressed and marginalized is invited, shared, and made into a start of a political struggle for universalism. That kind of universalism, or just thinking of universalism, is not something one can just deliberately generate, like I'm trying here. But sometimes you just wait for that to happen. I had a conversation about this very moment in this lecture, about universalism with our DCRL colleague Bernard Gegen, just before I came here to Brown. He sent me this quote, and I liked a lot. So I kind of quote Bernie, who quotes Donna Haraway, who quotes Gayatri Spivak on humanity. My stakes are high. I think we, that crucial material and rhetorical construction of politics and of history, need something called humanity. It is that kind of thing which Gayatri Spivak called that which we cannot not want. We also know now, from our perspectives, in the ripped open belly of the monster called history, that we cannot name and possess this thing which we cannot not desire. Humanity, whole and par, is not autochthonous. Help me. Yeah, it's not there. Never mind. Nobody is self-made. Nobody is self-made, least of all man. There's the spiritual and political meaning of post-structuralism and postmodernism for me. Now I would go back to the utopias, which in the case of public library first met in the 19th century. So there was a political one, which stands for public, and epistemological one, which stands for library. Also the idea of the world being united where people who are equal live peacefully. Public library got recognized and established as a social institution with a mission and role no one would almost ever question. I'll get to that shortly. League of Nations, United Nations, as I said before, it's complicated. The internet has, as in many other situations, completely changed our expectations and imagination about what is possible. The dream of catalog of the world, a universal approach to all available knowledge for every member of society, became realizable. A question merely of the meeting of curves on a graph, the point at which line of a global distribution of personal computers meets that of the critical mass of people with access to the internet. If not itself becoming the public library, internet should be, by any projection from the past before internet, knowing what is public library, what I just told you before, and then what is internet, at least it should let public libraries blossom. However, the emergence and development of the internet is taking place precisely at the point at which an institutional crisis, one with traumatic and inconceivable consequences, has also begun. The internet is a new challenge, creating experiences commonly proffered as revolutionary. Yet, a true revolution of the internet is the universal access to all knowledge that it makes possible. However, unlike the new epistemologies developed during the French Revolution, the tendency is to keep the old regime. Old regime being intellectual property rights, market concentration, and control of access. The new possibilities for classification, development of languages, invention of epistemologies which internet possess, which might launch off into new orbits from existing classification systems, are being suppressed. In fact, the reactionary forces of the old regime are staging a thermidor to suppress the public libraries from pursuing their mission. Today, public libraries cannot acquire, cannot even buy digital books from the world's largest publishers. The small amount of ebooks that they were able to acquire already, they must destroy after only 26 landings. Libraries and the principle of universal access to all existing knowledge that they embody are losing in every possible way. The battle with a market dominated by new players, Amazon.com, Google, and Apple. In 2012, Canada's Conservative Party-led government cut financial support for libraries and Archives Canada by 9.6 million, which resulted in the loss of 400 archivists and librarian jobs, the shutting down of some of internet pages of them, and the cancellation of the further purchase of new books. In only 3 years, from 2010 to 2012, some 10% of public libraries were closed in Great Britain. The commodification of knowledge, education, and schooling, which are the consequences of a globally harmonized, restrictive legal regime for intellectual property, together with neoliberal austerity politics, curtails the possibilities of adapting to new socio-technological conditions, let alone further development, innovation, or even basic maintenance of public libraries' infrastructure. Public libraries are an endangered institution doomed to extinction. Petit bourgeois denial prevents society from confronting this disturbing insight. As in many other fields, the only way out offered is innovative market-based entrepreneurship. Some have even suggested that the public library should become an open software platform on top of which creative developers can build app stores and app applications, or that the public libraries should be transformed into internet cafes for the poorest, ensuring that they are only a click away from Amazon.com catalog or from Google search bar. But these proposals overlook, perhaps deliberately, the fundamental principles of access upon which the idea of the public library was built. Those who are well-meaning, intelligent, and tactful will try to remind the public, Shannon Mattern, who was our fellow at DCRL a few months ago, she was writing a lot about that, to remind the public of all the many sides of the phenomenon that the public library is. Major community center, service for the vulnerable, center of literacy, informal and lifelong learning, a place where hobbyists, enthusiasts, old and young meet and share knowledge and skills. That's fascinating, no? Unfortunately, for purely tactical reasons, this reminder to the public does not always contain an explanation how these effects arise out of the foundational idea of public library, universal access to knowledge for every member of the society. That produces knowledge about knowledge, produces knowledge about knowledge transfer. The public library produces sociability. The public library does not need the sort of creative crisis management that wants to propose what the library should be transformed into once our society obsessed with market logic has made it impossible for the library to perform its main mission. Such proposals, if they do not insist on universal access to knowledge for all members of the society, are Trojan horses for the silent but galloping disappearance of the public library from the historical stage. Sociability, produced by public libraries with all the richness of its various appearances, will be best preserved if we manage to fight for the values upon which we have built the public library, and that's universal access to knowledge for each member of our society. Freedom, equality, and sisterhood, brotherhood need brave librarians practicing civil disobedience. Library Genesis, arg.org, at the moment arg.fail, Monoscope, UWeb are all examples of fragile knowledge infrastructures built and maintained by brave librarians practicing civil disobedience, which the world of researchers in the humanities rely on. I'm sure that all of you know about them. These projects are reinventing the public library in the gap left by today's institutions in crisis. These are the brave librarians and projects without we, Public Library Project, would never exist. If they were not in place before we started, we would not even have idea about it. So, Library Genesis. Library Genesis is an online repository with over 1 million books and is the first project in history to offer everyone on the internet free download of its entire book collection at once. And as of this writing, about 15 terabytes of data is the collection, maybe even more these days. I was writing this paragraph like 6 months ago. Together with the all metadata, so you can download the whole metadata, MySQL dump, and PHP, HTML, JavaScript, you can just run exactly the same mirror like they have. The most popular earlier repositories, such as Gigapedia and then later library.nu, handle their upload and maintenance costs by selling advertising space to the porno and gambling industries. Legal action was initiated against them, and they were closed. News of the termination of Gigapedia, library.nu strongly resonated among academics and book enthusiast circles, and it was even noted in the mainstream internet media, just like other major world events. Decision by Library Genesis to share its resources has resulted in a network of identical sites, so-called mirrors, to the development of an entire range of net services of metadata exchange and catalog maintenance, thus ensuring an exceptionally resistant survival architecture. ArgFail, or arg.org, there is a story behind that name, but I don't have enough time. If you want to hear it, just, come to me later. ArgOrg, started by artist Sean Dockery, is an online repository with over 50,000 books and texts, a community of enthusiastic. I get notifications from Twitter. Please don't do that. It just goes over my window. So enthusiast researchers from critical theory, contemporary art, philosophy, architecture, and other fields in the humanities. And it maintains catalogs, annotates, and initiates discussions around these collections. It is also a courseware extension to the self-organized education platform, the Public School. Ubu.com, another long story, some of the incidents actually started here. UbuWeb is the most significant, and also it proves how hard is to deal with the ideas humanity, universalism, and all of that. But yeah, never mind. We don't have to talk about that. I love Ken. He's my great friend, and I appreciate that he understood what kind of mistake that was. UbuWeb is the most significant and largest online archive of avant-garde art. It was initiated and is led by conceptual artist Kenneth Goldsmith. UbuWeb, although still informal, has grown into relevant and recognized critical institution of contemporary art. Artists want to see their work in its catalog, and thus agree to relationship with UbuWeb that has no formal contractual obligations. And then there is Monoscope. Again, I'm pretty sure that most of you know about it. Monoscope is a wiki for the arts, culture, and media technology with a special focus on the avant-garde, conceptual, and media arts of Eastern and Central Europe. It was launched by Dusan Barok and others. In the form of a blog, Dusan uploads to monoscope.org/log an online catalog of curated titles, highly recommended, at the moment numbering around 3,000. And as with UbuWeb, it is becoming more and more relevant as an online resource. Library Genesis, ARG.org, FAIL, Kenneth Goldsmith, and Dusan Barok show us that the future of the public library does not need crisis management, venture capital, startup incubators, or outsourcing, but simply the freedom to continue extending the dreams of Melville Dewey, Paul Otlet, and other visionary librarians, just as it did before the emergence of internet. With the emergence of the internet and software tools such as Calibre, I'll show you shortly, and Let's Share books I wrote, librarianship has been given an opportunity, similar to astronomy and the project SETI at Home, if you remember, to include thousands of amateur librarians who will, together with the experts, build a distributed peer-to-peer network to care for the catalog of available knowledge. And here is our reference implementation or proof of concept. I'll just show you now. So this is Calibre. Okay. And this is my, I'll just like, you can't see it because it got open on my window, which you can't see. Technology doesn't work by default. Then sometimes it works if you restart it, sometimes, yeah. Good. So what it does is that first, this is a Calibre. With one click, you can download the metadata from Google and Amazon, like this. You just say download metadata. And then you get the metadata which was meticulously cataloged by others, not Google and Amazon, who loves the books, just to make that clear. And then just with few clicks, you can really maintain a catalog of the books which are sitting around. And when you do that, which is super easy, then you can use this plugin and then start sharing. And when you start sharing, your Calibre library will be exposed to the world. You get into the chat room here. You can just invite your friends to go to this. Let me just. To this website, which aggregates all of the librarians, and then you will see, I hope that it's fast enough, yeah. So you can see here, oh, why it doesn't work. So you can see that there are 11 librarians online, and then if you go like this, then you get like the books, and then if you click on PDF or whatever, you will download it. If you click here, it will just open up the permalink, and then if you share that on Facebook or Twitter, it will just get fancy cover with the description and all of that. But also, if you have the plugin installed, then this icon, which is called Lodestone in Alchemy, it's a magnet, will actually, just like a magnet, bring all of the metadata and the book into your Calibre. So you can easily imagine that this is the system where you can easily maintain your catalog. You can easily share it with the others, and then the no metadata will be lost, and that's our goal. We don't want the bulk of the files without the metadata, which will just like sit around, and then there will be a couple of companies which will make the list of these, which will maintain the catalog, and then we'll rely on them. So yeah, I could show you much more about that vision, but I want to go further because I want to say more. Oh yeah, so one more thing I'll just show you. So it's Haute Pisane, Memory of the World. So this is a project we did a few months ago. This is just one of the librarians. So these are the books which were thrown away from the libraries in Croatia during the 90s. So whatever book was related to Serbian people, Serbian writers, authors, Serbian language, Cyrillic, Serbian publisher, so they're like Kant, because it was, Hegel, whatever, like the classics in that sense, they were thrown away because it was published by Serbian publishers. And at the same time, they would also throw away all of the books which had anything to do with the partisans and the anti-fascists winning in the Second World War, making the revolution for Yugoslavia. They would also get rid of all of the books which had any relation to working class, to Marxism, to socialism. So there was like in that sense, ideological cleansing. And what we did is that just for the 20th anniversary of the big war operation in Croatia, which resulted with 200,000 Serbs being kicked out from the country and Syria of war crimes, they were like celebrating that as a great war victory on 5th of August this year. And then before that, with the VHV curators, we did this project where we invited people to come with these books and scan them and share them and just do what we were already doing. And what is interesting is that it again proved that book has a very specific meaning in society. Very few people would really go against that. And you can see here, for example, this one, Ježeva kuća, and then maybe, let me see more. So we had also the books which are like the children books, like Priča starog kamena, or Pirgo, and a few others, Dr. Jojpo. So yeah, this one, for example. So this is the small partisan, whatever, the nice kid. So we didn't really get, we expected, because it was going against the status quo in Croatia, that we have much more radical right-wing angry, but they didn't. And I think that because the book has a very special meaning. That's why we cannot always talk about everything the same. So the book is, in that sense, it has a special position in our culture. If we bring the movies, even it would be the best art ever, it's still entertainment industry comparing to the book, which could be the pulp fiction, but still has a kind of different, heavy kind of, the weight semiotic. Okay. So we can for sure say that this proposal, a vision, and then reference implementation, that's what we call here. This is memoryoftheworld.org. And then our vision is not here. It's just, that's what we preach in a way. And then you can, of course, you can do your own. Jan Gerben and Sebastian Ludger are probably coming up with another great piece of software, Open Media Library, check it out. So there are ways how we can maintain that vision. This is just one proof of concept. And it resonates with people's hearts. That's, I'm now sure. After 3 years of talking, preaching, I'm sure that it resonates. After launch in Ljubljana in 2012, in 2014, we transform again the space. Just like after Ljubljana, the space of Stuttgart's Kunstverein into public library. Then in Zagreb, a couple of months ago, I just told you a few things. We did it in Galeria Noma. And then public library was exhibited in Reina Sofia Museum, which is like super fancy. Invited to Transmediale, Calvet 22 in London, 96 Weeks in Beirut, a lot of places. And one of these is also being the keynote here at Brown. This is not end of my talk, but I have to say here, thank you very much for letting me open this conference. From the very beginning, we were trying to anticipate what are the legal consequences of our and the civil disobedience of projects we respect and support. We would always half-jokingly invite the organizers as witnesses to the court case from the near future. Invite it. We always felt that there is a consequence of implementing the inappropriate concepts into the legal regimes. In our case, the inappropriate concept is intellectual property. So the consequence is a society full of schizophrenic subjects. That particular regulation made almost the whole population into criminals. Our favorite joke some 10 years ago was the question, do you know anyone who knows someone knowing someone else who never downloaded illegal software, music, movies, games, or books? And if I just leave you like for a second, then few of us will always come up with the answer, and that's also what we meant, is that dear grandmother. But now the schizophrenic ambient didn't end for at least 10 years at all. And we are left with the morbid joke saying that there are only few grandmothers left these days who are not criminals because our grandmothers are dying. And we will be the grandfathers' mothers. When David Garcia and Eric Luttenberg invited me to write for their forthcoming book, Tactical Media, these were the ideas discussed with my dear friend and partner in crime, Tomislav Medak. We got a contract by MIT Press. Usual things, no money, no rights, few rights, prestige. Yeah, I can show you that, just a second. No, you know about it. It's an MIT Press contract, like saying, oh, sign it, great, yeah. And then that didn't catch our attention. But then a week later, we also got a takedown notice. René? Yeah, cease and desist. Yeah, okay. So we got a cease and desist, a takedown notice from the same MIT Press. So for the same project, we got contract to sign for the same project to write about. We got a takedown notice, and I'll just show you that. This is how it looks like. This is not from MIT Press. This is just the icon I have for my domain. Yeah, please read it. Yeah, it says, yeah. So I'm not sure if that qualifies for the irony, but I found quite hilarious that takedown notice was for the book Art Power of Boris Groys. Thank you. I'll just show you that. Yeah. So if I would see someone doing these cheap semiotic plays, I would probably boo silently from the audience. But at the same time, I would also understand the giggling excitement of anyone doing it. That's what I'm doing. I would be also a little envy, and of course, let the bastard do the thing, and that's what I expect from you. I'll do that thing. Boris Groys is famous to call Jesus Christ first ready-made. And an author I found as one of the best writing on Russian or Soviet constructivism and avant-garde. Quite few of my communist friends, comrades, would ask me to remove this book for being too liberal, too conservative, whatnot. But I want to say I love Groys' writings. And I'll just, let me see if I have it here. Where is Boris Groys? I should have it here. Boris Groys. Yeah, I would give me just a second. I want to show you the Boris Groys table of contents. That's at least, I prepared like the full of the, so just imagine, that's the game, They send me that takedown notice, and then for the book, for the project, I'm supposed to write about, and then inside of that book, you can find so many schizophrenic moments, which you can call hilarious, funny, ironic, or whatever. And I'll just look at, if you're not familiar, you have on the new, then you have the privatization, artificial paradise of post-communism. Art is at war. So what's happening is actually that MIT Press is actually teaching me to do all of this, and want to punish me. And that's what happens when you have that schizophrenic ambient. So I'm sure you can easily imagine how many books published by MIT could support the civil disobedience and fight against the exclusivity of the world today, but also the exclusivity of MIT or MIT Press in particular, who are just like other publishers today. But in case of MIT, then MIT Press in particular, there are a number of promises and legacy they cannot anymore stand for. And in the same way, the bourgeois revolution could be revisited and liberal democracy check if the promises we found foundational for the society, if they are still here. That's what I would like to ask everybody here. And MIT appeared in our little story as one of the best examples of schizophrenic subject. MIT is proud of starting hacking, but then killing our hacker's hero, internet's own boy. They're proud of opening up knowledge resources, but then using its IP addresses range exclusively only for the insiders. What I would like to say, it can go forever, but what I would like to say here is that I don't see schizophrenic deadlock as something evil, nor that MIT is evil. It's tragical. In some of the things which happened before it, it's tragic. But just that inappropriate values and concept become part of our, when it becomes part of our legal regulation, this is where we end up. And we cannot like go further with that. So I'll just go back. I'll very shortly show you that. I was doing that almost the whole summer, kind of thinking that I will show it here in more of the whatever spotlight, but then I just realized that I don't have enough time. So the one which I just showed you was about access to knowledge. So it's kind of easy for someone who knows how to program to make a set of tools and then circumvent all of that, and also build a platform for the people thinking like that, and actually build the useful and great infrastructures. But then there is another dream. If you remember, the League of Nations, United Nations, and that whole like the world one and blah, blah, blah. And then, as I just told you also, that internet didn't really support the access to knowledge because public libraries will disappear, and internet could help. With the world is one, it kind of resonates again. Internet was also for a while meant to be the world is one, like that no one, you know the famous kind of, the dog, no one knows that you're a dog on internet, things like that, but also no one knows if you're coming from a certain country, if you're not in the part of the university campus, and things like that. That's what internet, but we just ended up in a world where there's so many exclusivities. You can check that out. So we started with IP addresses, which were in that sense neutral, and that's what most of the people enthusiastic about the internet, that's what they were claiming. TCP/IP, it's neutral. It's kind of like a people are equal kind of idea. And then by time, some companies were annotating the lists of the IP addresses, and they would annotate and say, this public IP address is from that country, and then this is from that country. And then we ended up in Germany, where you can't see half of the YouTube because of Gamma. We ended up in UK, where, or like anyone outside of UK cannot see BBC. We ended up in Iceland, and in UK, you can't see the Pirate Bay. So we are getting there. And also, more and more like universities are just not open. You have like a very exclusive access there. So I made a simple tool. And again, kind of an irony is that I couldn't show you the chub.club. Let me see. That's again, but then Dubravka. So what I didn't want to demonstrate this, but I couldn't see. I will tell you about the Science Hub now. I'm only need like 2 or 3 minutes more. I couldn't see it. Is that working now? Is your tunnel works? Yeah, I started it. Okay. Whatever. This is when I got it, and this is how you use it. So Dubravka was using, where's that? Is using, okay, this is a mess. It's becoming more of a mess. Huh? Yeah, here, sorry. So this is the setup. So if you run that, you just say set up a tunnel as a Jessica. It comes from the science fiction movie. That's another great story, but later, I can't tell you here. It's a great, They run away from the dystopian city through a tunnel, whatever. So then Jessica copied that URL. It sends to Logan, and then Logan goes with this kind of a Chrome extension. It goes to that URL and then just goes through the Jessica to the internet. And that's how I got Science Hub, because here I couldn't see it, and I wanted to show you this. And I couldn't get from here. So then Dubravka was like, and even she's here, but through VPN, she's at the high, and at the high actually didn't notice probably, but they let us see this. And Science Hub is exactly the same kind of circumventing techniques. So it's a platform where a lot of tunnels, a lot of kind of sharing of the accounts is happening. And if you are interested in downloading scientific articles, then this is the place where you should go. And in real time, you will get to JSTOR, Sage. And if you are like a students of privileged universities, maybe you don't care, you should. And you also should start you should start to let me see, yeah, I'm just finishing. So Alexandra Elpakian, don't know how to pronounce that. So she was a student from Kazakhstan, and then she couldn't get the scientific articles, and she was a computer scientist, so she knew how to do that, and it's super easy. We spend a lot of time because you guys don't know how to use terminal. Please learn how to use terminal, and you will be able to do this in a second. But then, if not, then we have to, build the GUIs for that. So what she was saying, when I was working on my research project, I found out that all research papers I needed for work were paywall. I was a student in Kazakhstan at the time, and our university was not subscribed to anything, which is not a surprise, I would say, unfortunately. And then Elsevier got against her. Yeah, I'm done. Thanks to Elsevier lawsuit, I got past the point of no return. At this time, I don't have to prove we have the full right to do this or risk being executed like other pirates. She goes as far as she can. She's my heroine. I think that she should be everybody's heroine and hero. And also, she's here referring to the tragedy of our hero. And here I will just read you for the end from Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto by Aaron Swartz. I agree, many say. Well, just, yeah, I can just leave you. So yeah, you have a duty to share it with the world. And then it also ends up with enough of us around the world, we'll not just send a strong message opposing the privatization of knowledge, we'll make it a thing of the past. Will you join us? So yeah, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Yes, okay. Look, thanks to everybody who's made this possible, especially the organizers and the fabulous production staff and the staff in this room who pulled this slideshow out of trouble. It's a high-def slideshow and it's not a high-def projector, so occasionally when you see some of the small-sized type drift off out of focus, that's not an aesthetic gesture, that's a technical fail. So I'd like to propose that archives are places where media theory is produced. The easy way to say this is to take an inclusive shortcut and assert that archives theory is one of many subsets of media theory. But we could discuss that for years, and there's probably a case to be made that it's actually the other way around. So because thinking about archives is what I do, I'd rather tickle you with a few thoughts about archives, thoughts that might reverberate through our discussions this weekend. And since the theory and practice of archives is way behind where it ought to be, or where it needs to be, I hope that some reflection on the terms of media will also add clarity to the terms that archives themselves and archivists like me negotiate and produce. The recent history of archives is full of inspiring stories of emergence and visibility, but it's very much a tale of neglect, of utopian cards unplayed, of disrespect for archival labor, and of theories that are often too diffuse to be actionable. But I'm optimistic about the possibilities that archives afford right now in the history of record keeping, in the history of media. And so I want to parallel archives and media to try and better understand what archives might be and under what conditions they exist, and then perhaps use the archives as a kind of spur to reconsider some of the conditions under which media and scholarship are produced. We've yet to sort out the set of symmetries and dissonances between media and the archives where media settles, hopefully to flourish, but more often than not to die. Archives set terms and limits for scholarship, especially digital scholarship, even when scholars aren't directly referencing them. And they also set some of the terms, or they collaborate tacitly in setting terms for history as it's publicly practiced and as it's a publicly received enterprise. We'll come back to this. And also in an era where the pace of personal media production is wildly accelerating, we're starting to recognize that it's hard to build walls between our personal digital workspaces and the custodians who are in charge of our digital productions. So for about 10 years, I've been speaking publicly about archives, and one of the most striking take-homes for me has been that we, as a community of scholars, don't think very imaginatively about archives. We think of archives as somewhat glorified warehouses, as service organizations, and we outsource the maintenance of our research base to workers whom we insufficiently respect. Unfortunately, I can't credit most archivists with more imagination. There are a few, and some of you are here, but many of us not. So it's no less urgent to intervene in the flow of archival theory than it is in media theory. The divide between people who think about archives and people who work in them is striking, and it's unproductive. And the divide is manifested in language, in status, and in workflow. And some of you may notice that I'm using the term archives rather than the archive. I don't consider the two terms interchangeable. I'm really fascinated by the imprecision that exists between archives, which most archivists would define this way: places of collecting, preservation, access, archival labor, and the archive, which I take as an umbrella term for conceptual, philosophical, artistic, literary, historical, analytic constructs that are centered around archives or archival process. Most writers and artists have gravitated to the term archive in the singular. Some also use the archive and the archives interchangeably without interrogating possible differences. But you know, the fuzziness is vexing, and it's especially vexing to archivists. An unstable amalgam of the unconscious and the quotidian, the archive, has become an undemanding construct. It serves, and I'm not saying this to offend, but I admit that it's a rant. It serves the critical disciplines as they interact with history and memory without necessarily requiring sharp definition. You might think of the archive rendering as a screen onto which traces of theory flash for long moments before fading. So that for artists, writers, and theorists, the archive is a kind of terra nullius. It's open for unchallenged occupation. The archive invites flirtation. The archives, on the other hand, couldn't be more demanding. Though their workplaces may seem quiet and their workflows pretend to appear apolitical, archives overflow with contention. To collect is to commit to the survival of certain records over others. To arrange and to describe is often to enclose. To preserve is to resist power, violence, and constraint. To proffer access is to invite misunderstanding and aggression. And yet archives yearn for praxis. Even menial archival labor is practice in search of theory. So I hope you'll excuse the polarization, because I hope we can move towards reuniting them and the practices to which they refer. Could we try to draw connections between academic, between artistic, between archival labor? Could we try to link the conceptual umbrella with the more quotidian work of the archives? Could we daylight archival theory? Could we listen harder to the people who perform archival labor and begin to think of it as cultural work or research rather than simply wage labor? Interestingly enough, few people have ever considered the politics of archival workflow. And this alone would be cause for intervention. But the problem may be more fundamental than that. The word archives carries a lot of baggage. It implies enclosure, defined by a set of rules. It's a place for documents firmly situated in the past. Could we throw out our preconceptions or our predispositions about archives and try some new definitions? In fact, let's forget definitions, let's try dreams. Here are a few utopian archival propositions. A storage and delivery infrastructure for evidence and memory that is as reliable as city water or gravity-propelled Roman sewage systems, and scalable and flexible enough to remember or forget as needed. You Europeans are into forgetting right now, which is great. A data corpus that surrounds us like air, manifesting itself through our sensorium, and the tools with which we augment our bodies, or alternatively, a mycelial network that feeds on data to propagate and spread. A locus or loci of preservation of information and ideas that's capable of collecting both canonical and quotidian, hegemonic and oppositional, personal and institutional. An anticipatory network that sniffs out, appraises, and collects records of potential interest. A fully permeable repository that supports a spectrum of access, from casual inquiry to deep touch. An agnostic system that dissolves formalistic distinctions between physical and digital materials. A suite of preservation functions that simultaneously support centralized and decentralized storage schemes. An organ that embodies the power of the record while simultaneously disavowing it. That is to say, both privileged and anti-privileged. I want to say that during the war, there was an all-woman TV station in Chicago, and many of the women hung on for some years. And this is the only time this has ever happened in American history, really, until the 90s. A curatorial algorithm that doesn't automatically reject garble and glitch. I love that. Heat with fresh spouse. A utility that familiarizes us with its holdings through convenience and defamiliarizes them through inconvenience. And an entity that in its scope and outreach crosses anachronistic species boundaries. Even those of us who are suspicious of archival utopianism realize that traditional archives deliver much less than they promise. They're compromised entities. They're gated rather than hospitable. They're poor entities, archives poveri in a rich world. These deficiencies have often split archives from scholars who can't get the records they want in the manner they want. This is, of course, where the beauty of what Marcel is doing. And the gap between actual and potential may help explain why anxiety has become the default mindset in the archival world. Anxiety is debilitating, it's distracting, it causes many archivists to forget that in fact they often perform better than they imagine. Do physical objects have rights? It was transformative to work with Internet Archive starting in 1999. Their motto, by the way, is universal access to all knowledge. In 99, to build an online repository of digitized films. Every custodian of archives should have the luck that I had. The barriers that often separate collections from those who would use them melted away. And I had the satisfying experience of seeing materials that had been sitting on my steel shelves for years pushed out to anyone who might be interested. We've had well over 100 million access events. It's impossible to count the number of derivative works. Content lost its provenance and it became infrastructure. And you know, that is the greatest honor an archives can receive. The destiny of any cultural collection ought to be consumed and I suppose regurgitated. I became a rabid proponent of mass digitization and worked with the archive in the mid-2000s to help build out an open path for mass book scanning that functioned as an alternative to Google's then highly closed and secretive Books project. And concurrently, I was working with my partner to co-found a physical library in San Francisco. We've now been open for 11 years. Books, you know, this is, in a sense, it's a parallel discourse to the talk that we've just heard, but I want to say that this was a thoroughly anti-nostalgic project. Our unvoiced idea, but our principal idea, was to experiment with opening a repository of physical materials to a non-institutional community who didn't have the identification to get into a research library and see what might happen. And in the absence of any hypothesis, the results were even more surprising. Very quickly, we learned to dismiss any sense of analog nostalgia or digital supersession. And it became clear that, and I'm going to transcode a formulation from the artist and writer Jen Bervin, that physical and digital materials each had different jobs to do. It was pointless to think about opposing analog to digital, unless you were talking about obvious attributes like weight, physical bulk, dependence upon electron flow, or if you needed conflict for an otherwise pedestrian news story. And since then, I've been convinced that analog-digital hybridity is not a transitional state. I hope it remains a permanent one. In my work with our library and my film archives, I've come to realize that the turn to digital revalidates the analog. I make digital films that play before audience who talk while the film runs. You may talk, of course. I thought this was radical until I realized that what I was doing was actually just channeling the Elizabethan theater, whose front pit was filled with loud and boisterous groundlings, kind of a hybridized analog and digital. But while digitality may revalidate analog, it's rapidly devaluing it. And physical objects are being disposed of and destroyed at an accelerated rate. This is one reason why we have these amazing things in our library. It's now possible to ask librarians and archivists a highly impertinent question. Do physical objects still have the right to exist? For some media, like newspapers and journals and even videotape, this has already been settled in the negative. Shelves are empty or stacks are gone, as you know. I'm not mourning this because although I'm against the intentional destruction of cultural material, that's an act of aggression, I've come to believe that loss is formative. We pursue research precisely because we perceive gaps in the record, or because we come to recognize that the powerful have suppressed evidence about the powerless. So many of the emergent histories of the last 50 years, the histories of peoples of color, the histories of women, histories of gender, regional and labor histories, for example, so much of this work has been prompted by a sense of suppression and a sense of absence. The crisis ecosystem of evidence-bearing physical objects has become really fascinating. I didn't do that, by the way. It's a genuine found image. Somebody else did that. The expulsion of physical materials in favor of digital surrogates is akin to urban gentrification. And as scholars and as a society, we're one day going to have to answer for it. Because the attributes that distinguish the physical are exactly what we need to preserve. And they're a pain. Physical objects, no matter how many we discard, are incredibly persistent. And their persistence is very inconvenient. They're the table scraps, the leftovers of digitization, and there aren't enough dogs around the table to gobble them down. We're basing entire new phenomenological and philosophical agendas, to say nothing about how we configure scholarship, on a single iteration of technology. And we have to engage physical materials in combat in order to make room for apparent digital abundance. And then the fragility of the digital. You know, digitality is inconvenient in a different way, I think, than physical objects. It has, despite its apparent victory over physical media, digitality is fragile. It requires a compliant social order, the accommodation of governments, and the steady availability of energy. It is not a monolith. The Chinese digital world works differently than the North American, and its corporate structures and business models are experimental. In a sense, we cannot overreact today to a force that will behave differently tomorrow. This has been something that I say to archivists who are freaked out, and I'm not sure to what extent this message remaps to other groups, but I think it's an important message. There's the air of romantic obsolescence that surrounds a lot of historical media and communications technology today is quite striking and entertaining. And we might actually enlist it to help build a bridge between media archaeologists and the public. But I don't find much of it defamiliarizing. You know, while the landscape of Detroit or any other deindustrialized city, for that matter, is a rich text, filled with threads of evidence that implicate many players, most visitors see only ruin porn. Dead media, failed kludges, speculative engineering ventures that pass neither usability nor smell tests, and express poorly integrated relationships between information and its embodiments. All of these things are deeply fascinating, but we need to squeeze those neglected margins hard. And yet anything we can do to alienate the unreasonable faith that much of the world seems to have in the robustness and persistence and the essential rightness of the digital, anything we can do to alienate that would be most welcome, as long maybe as we're not fetishizing digital fragility or mourning in advance. If I may generalize, many archivists also fetishize extinct media technologies. Those are the people that are buying all the old film projectors. They sit up at night. Worrying not about their eBay overspending, but about digital precarity. The archival axioms of permanence and provenance do not remap well into the digital domain, where everything is as fragile as the next power spike, brownout, or coronal mass ejection. In the aggregate, archivists think a great deal about the implications and the contradictions of digital repositories, but like many who think as futurists, they have yet to reflect on how these peculiar databases will function socially. Digital archives are already pervasive. In a sense, they might also be total archives, not simply reservoirs of power, but organs of power as well, operative. Functions like transmission lines that store energy as well as propagate it. Both archivists and non-archivists are trying to track and parse the disruptions that digital media and digital repositories have brought to the rather quiet disciplines that our predecessors secretly hoped they could follow in peace and privilege until their temporary abilities faded, some of us as well. It's destabilizing. It's like being at a picnic populated by anxious family members. You're on turf dominated at least temporarily by others. Your sensorium vibrates with overstimulation, but you cannot follow the house cat under the couch. Your perceptual system sends untestable messages to process, while your interpretive lines are clogged with tests that iterate and reiterate, looping in anxiety. But 20 feet beyond the picnic tables, the park is quiet. It's abiding its time in the sunlight. It's untouched by the aggro under the trees. Picnics, of course, can also be fun. They're banquets of continuity. They're reiterations of unsurprise. We're distracted by the skins of scale and speed that are wrapped over terms that might not all necessarily have to be renegotiated. I'm not being nostalgic. I'm just trying as hard as I can to be radically traditionalist during my visit to New England. For a time, I felt like I was part of a digital vanguard, making CD-ROMs with the Voyager Company in the early and mid-1990s, putting archival films online, scanning books from our little library, feeling, and this is an admission with some shame, feeling a little sorry for my friends on the other side of what was then a digital crevice. But now it's different. Digitality and privilege have been inverted. To speak personally with a bureaucrat, collecting and touching artisanal objects, writing with a nice pen, these are privileged encounters. The rest of the world wrestles with phone menus, cheaply made goods, and poorly designed websites. But there are no stray bits in your slow food. And slow media is coming back. Some friends, guided by this man who's a Sam Cronick from Minneapolis and now San Francisco, some friends are building an intentional community in Mendocino County on the Northern California coast. They're laying fiber on their farm and worked a lot harder than they thought they would. But the fiber is crippled, so it transmits data slowly, and their internet service is only up between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Neo-traditionalism, stories and theories. Our newly ex-Librarian of Congress, James Billington, liked to say, stories unite people, theories divide them. It's funny, I always wanted the opposite to be true. Like Brecht in his epic theater, I placed high priority on dividing the audience. And of course, I hoped the world would unite around certain theories. And I'm absolutely unconvinced of the centrality and the absolute value of storytelling. You know, museum curators, archivists, and many historians look for ways to narrativize evidence. In this, they are part of a system-wide project to tell stories. The gatekeepers of documentary film, most conspicuously, almost always require the work they fund to contain compelling characters and a narrative arc. The ambiguity and the enigmatic nature of images and a lot of evidence, which could lead in so many directions, is forced into the channel most useful to establish a story that can be told within the bounds of budget and mass comprehension, and sometimes, of course, within the bounds of triumphalism. We cannot narrate media archaeologies in this manner, nor can we tell most stories well. I find the evidence itself to be what's most interesting. Most of what we see drawn out of archives is overtold. It's encrusted with narrative. The poet and teacher Barrett Watton writes about narrative as malware infecting his words as well as his machine. I want to find a place for foregrounding the record itself with relatively little storytelling. In other words, seek to encourage a new kind of negotiation between the document and its users, and let a more or less contextualized or even a decontextualized document find its own path. This might mean trusting evidence over interpretation. Evidence, I believe, can be its own narrative, storytelling, a special interest. Archives could push back against the terms that restrain publicly practiced and received histories. To do this doesn't, doing this doesn't just mean foregrounding underrepresented narratives and records that have been suppressed by force and violence, but actively pushing out records that represent anomalies, that document personalities, cultures, and technologies that don't fit into received timelines, really kind of a queering process. Home movies exemplify this kind of record in the way that they can be taken to resist stereotypes of race, gender, class, and place. What I've learned from collecting home movies is that they're counter-stereotypical above all. Of course, this pushback resembles media history and media archaeology. Media archaeologists and anxious, this is a real live cycling hobo, 100% authentic from 1940. When I show this, everybody says, Portland, which is extremely unfair. Hats off to you too. Media archaeologists and anxious industry executives share at least one attribute, and that's a special concern for media technologies and practices that originate at the periphery of established media industries. Both are very interested in the challenges these might pose to dominant forms. In so doing, they peek into a future where suits and titles may no longer get much respect. Archives are equally challenged by vernacular or popular efforts to collect, to manage and preserve the historical record, and only the most courageous among them have looked into the future, seen decentralization, and said, this is good. The archival future is, in my view, a lot more about coordination than it's going to be about collecting. What future archivists are able to save will be the result of billions of lucky accidents, and one of their jobs will be to share knowledge of what data persists and to keep track of idiosyncratic evolution. We're seeing this a little bit in the web archiving space, but it's embryonic. Popular archival practice gets much less attention than vernacular media, but it's excitingly disruptive. Independent and community collections enable research in ways that more traditionally organized institutions can't. We may not present our materials on lovingly contextualized and vetted websites, but we shovel a lot of material online to surprise and enrich our users. And by defamiliarizing the compartmentalization and the seemingly mysterious workflows that exist in most special collections, we encourage our users and our longer distance fans to think about the workings of future libraries and archives. Of all entities that we ever call archival, independent, community, and amateur collections come closest to actionable spaces. All the virtues, they possess all the virtues, not to mention the flaws of amateurism. So Robert C. Binkley celebrated amateurism before he died very young in 1940. He spoke of amateur historians, collectors and independent scholars as a kind of citizen army whose self-motivated efforts could fill gaps unaddressed by libraries, archives, and universities. Long before E.P. Thompson popularized the phrase history from below, which is actually originated, I think, by a French contemporary of Binkley's in the 30s. Binkley addressed the work that the Academy was leaving undone, and even the crisis in scholarly publishing, 1930s style. He imagined a kind of distributed research and publishing system that had a place for amateurs, the credentialed, and the unemployed, a system that made use of multiple transitional technologies like micro-publishing, offset printing, and strike-on typesetting. He promoted, and he may have even conceived, the WPA Works program for unemployed intellectuals in Ohio, where they got work inventorying local history collections and indexing historical newspapers. And a close reading of his 1936 book, The Manual on Methods of Reproducing Research Materials, is very rewarding. It reveals little foreknowledge of electronics, but much anticipation of the attributes of the internet as a system for scholarly communication and the turn towards digital humanities. And you see here I've pulled a couple of clippings about populism, but what's actually interesting, even more interesting on the left side towards the bottom, the prospective disintegration of the distinction between collecting and publishing. Again, an echo of Marcel, but a prefiguration of the net. In Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, human life has been extended to several hundred years, but the bioscience of memory extension lags behind. Many people, therefore, drawn to try and reconstruct events that happened over a century ago. And in so doing, they frequently search databases to prompt their fading memories. And interestingly enough, almost all those searches reference personal records. And that got me thinking about the future of queries. And I got to wondering whether repositories of personal records and microhistories will become far more pertinent to the needs of future searchers than institutional and government records, especially, of course, if you consider the content of surveillance databases to be personal records. The volume of personal media production is historically off scale. It's very hard in this environment to tell what's archival and what's contemporary. The residual and the emergent don't just coexist, but they combine. All of the major services, I don't need to mention their names, even the sadly languishing Flickr, are these pseudo-archives that support quotation and reframing back to the earliest uploads. So in a lot of ways, it's more productive maybe to think about personal media production as happening within these constantly updating workspaces that are sort of personal, that share common objects with custodial services that look a lot like archives, but whose archival compact with users, as I've said elsewhere, is a non-committal handshake. Here, I'm really only going to mention that there's a spectrum of personal record keeping that begins in the deep analog era. You see what? Yeah, this is what I see on my long commute to Santa Cruz. Scratches in the sand, graffiti, quilts, diaries, and then, in the center, perhaps, is home movies and home video and digital movies. But then we move on to endoscopy, and cameras that are integrated into the body, and maybe one day's brainwaves. What I guess I want to say about personal records is that they're highly granular. They're often uncharismatic. They're extremely inconvenient. They're frequently unreleasable. They're eminently unselectable. They're effectively infinite. You could argue that the fire hose of personal records is going to require big institutions to collect at scale, but you could equally say that individuals are more likely to preserve them. These records are so difficult. Who owns them? Who keeps them? Who can forget me? How can I be forgotten? This weird mirroring between records in the open and the closed worlds. All those jokes about the NSA as the ultimate backup. It's remarkable how much people are willing to reveal publicly or semi-publicly. We know that. Here's my hunch, that people are less worried about their original data in all of its granularity. They're more worried about the timelines and the narratives that others might make of it, that unmodulated evidence might be less sensitive. Archivists go to Personal Digital Archives Conference and they throw their hands up in the air. What they often end up doing is building tools for analysis and processing, because the big questions are so hard and the massive data so unknowable. As an optimist, I would like to say that I think the weight of the quotidian record lifts away when we stop fussing and actually engage with it. That the flour, the oil, and the salt some of us store against the prospect of apocalyptic starvation is a lot easier to refresh when it's drawn from. It's all too evident that engineer. This is why I went to Android. It's all too evident that engineers have a great deal to do with the design of digital archives. One of the consequences is that they tend to root around what they perceive as inconvenience. The early 2010s will be remembered as a time when queries and recommendation engines got pretty good and began to rule. At the same time, digital libraries are still industriously writing grants to simulate the serendipity that's produced for free in library stacks. And as digital repositories become more complex and diverse, they get harder to classify. The database becomes soupier, less structured. The locus of intelligence shifts from structured data to smarter queries. I surmise that we're seeing this happening with Google search, that the intelligence is in the query. But the engineering goal remains the same, to link queries more closely to results. And this is hard for the flaneur in me to accept. What happened to the cyberpunk idea of oneness, of being the data, of jacking, that's to say hacking into data sets such that bits directly stimulated the senses? There is little serendipity in a black hole. Bouvard and Pécuchet would have loved Google, but then there could have been no novel. Spending time with contemporary digital archives can be overstimulating, but it's a different sort of engagement. There's rarely an organic point of entry into digital repositories. Usually, some kind of archival portal keeps us at a distance. There's a frame around the picture that keeps archives from integrating with the rest of the web and the world. You can deep link into Internet Archive, a rare exception, but you've all experienced the mediations between JSTOR, ProQuest, and their users, and of course it's precisely that level of mediation that led to the death of Aaron Swartz. In a world built on illusion and citation, this should be anomalous, but we leave bricolage up to the artists and to commercial culture, which of course has no problem blending newborn memes and adopted ones. And yet, I'm not so sure we're going to be well served by this excess of affordances. Look again at Bouvard and Pécuchet, who are lost in the 19th century supermarket of ideas, and their home-built laboratory that's filled with once-used equipment. If you have not read this book, I highly recommend it. It will clarify, I think, many of the things that you're thinking about these days. Or their New England equivalent, the Peterkin family. Did anybody read the Peterkin papers growing up? It's really a satire on the transcendentalists. They spend the length of a story trying to get their son. Their sons are named Agamemnon and Solomon John, and Solomon John wants to write a book, so he needs paper, ink, and quills. And when he sits down at his desk, surrounded by expectant family members, he looks up and states, "But I haven't got anything to say." Archival enclosure is a systemic problem and a bad inconvenience, but there are also formative inconveniences, and I like to think of them as good affordances. Wrangling with inconvenience is like choosing to write by hand instead of typing or dictating. You learn more about the words you're processing. This is a little excerpt from a stock footage catalog of a private company in LA where the cataloger just ranted about her coworkers. No one could find because lady put in can without entering keynote. It's really great reading. Film is inconvenient. It's hard to show. It takes time, labor, resources to inspect, repair, document, prep for scanning, scan, and edit. But you learn about the film you're making by touching its physical constituents. Inconvenience enables defamiliarization, which is what makes movies possible. And if we can learn anything from the current state of archives, it will not be because of ease. It will be prompted by inconvenience. The lessons arise out of breaks in continuity, out of imperfect narratives and interruptions in order. And we will, of course, need to interrupt archival theory itself, whose pretensions to permanence read rather quixotically in an age of mass extinction. It would be a generous act to read archives as media and to think of them as producers of media theory. We need to think of archives as players in an environment that's all about transmission and reception. Then the archival project of the moment, which revolves around superseding this heritage of enclosure with a culture of hospitable transaction, should also influence the work of media theory. So for the moment, I'd like to offer archives not as terra nullius, but as a lab for working out some of the changing conditions that affect media and history. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. Those were spectacular. So we have now time for Q&A. We could start by having you two pose questions to each other and then open it up. Or comments?
I had a question, actually. One of the things that was very, very inspiring about your talk was the just how you articulated the concept of public as systematically and as deeply as you can. But you know, our mutual friend Ian Boll doesn't like the concept of the public. He says the public domain is ours by grace of the state, and he poses the commons as an alternative. And I wondered if you might maybe counterpose public and commons in your mind?
I wouldn't really go in like too much of a theory there. I think that for me it's more like a tactical one for the moment, and then I yeah, I agree that it's very important to get into the common ground, something which is common for all of us, and then not rely on state in that sense. But at the same time, there is some kind of a tactical balance we should know about where it can easily be then, we can be easily useful idiots for the libertarians then, which I kind of don't really like to be. So yeah, I mean, I can't really say, yeah, I know the question. There were a couple of years ago, there were just a series of conferences really going into all possible ways how we can distinguish public and commons. And I kind of got fed up with that. I mean, I would go for both because both are very unlikely to happen. So yeah, then if one which is not good is happening, then I would go for another one. So in a sense, for me, it's yeah, I wouldn't go at the moment, and I don't feel that I'm the one to theorize on these like very nuances of the terms.
And Marcel, do you have a question for Rick?
Kind of, yeah. It's kind of more ambiental than the very particular ones. If I can do that later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, because we would love to open it up. And as well, there have been an amazing Twitter stream and many people following the simulcast. So, hello everyone out there, welcome. So, questions. We have a mic roaming around. Thank you so much from the audience. Silence.
We've tired them out.
You've beaten them into submission. Okay.
Hi, thank you. I just have maybe a question to Rick that maybe you probably get quite often. I was just wondering what for you is the difference between archiving and hoarding, between documentation of culture and knowledge and control, obsession, and energy, waste of energy. And I'm wondering, because we talk about massive server farms and waste of so much energy that is going into documenting stuff that we should forget. Why remember? And it's a big question, but I am wondering what your opinion on that is.
That's a lovely question, and here's why. I mean, hoarding is like one of these things that's like dogs and cats that on an individual level have relatively little impact if you keep them inside and don't let them kill other animals, but they don't scale very well. And the same is true with hoarding. You know, on an individual level, it can be pathological, it might not, but this notion of the disk spinning for trivia is a concern. But, you know, I want to point to, if any of you read Scott Herring's new book called The Hoarders, It is freaking awesome. He's a professor at Indiana, and he comes out of queer theory and culture. And what he's trying to do is depathologize hoarding. And he sees hoarding, it is sometimes often a manifestation of confusion and some deep-seated problems. But he also sees it as an anti-consumerist practice, and he really works very hard. Talking about Grey Gardens and talking about his, fights with his boyfriend and stuff, to try to depathologize it and talk about what in hoarding is actually positive. And there's also been that piece in, Jacobin, whatever you think of that counterposes, hoarding to the world of the squeaky clean world of the Apple Store. And the kind of lifestyle that's implied. So I'm conditionally really interested in trying to figure out how hoarding actually might be personal archival practice. Hoarding in a lot of ways to me seems a response to being culturally confused and decentered and thrown off base by the massive inputs that exist in the world right now. And there's usually a strong reason why many things are kept. So I think we need a discourse of hoarding that doesn't, at the outset say this is bad, this is wrong. On a massive scale level, we got anything that uses a lot of energy is an issue.
Hello, thank you. Regarding that wonderful line, loss is formative. If loss is experienced as inconvenience, what term or series of terms or family of terms may serve best to spur reformation? Do we seek to reclaim convenience with our use of archives too exclusively? And if so, what other creative modality and term that could harness such creative modality in using archives could kind of open up a different way of thinking or using records?
If I understand your question properly, and forgive me if I don't, it seems to me that what you really want to redeem is agency, community, and power.
Okay.
That's the reason archives are means to an end. There are incredible, there's great case studies of archives that express common interests, community interests, being used as points of, around which movements can coalesce. And I guess that's sort of what's in my mind about that.
So if you could just move the microphone behind you. And then there's also a question there by the person whose last name we can't pronounce. Yes. And Nishant.
So I have a question for Marcel. I was just wondering, from your presentation, I gather that you are a proponent of the free dissemination of knowledge. But I am wondering, what is your take on media piracy then? And would you consider, free dissemination, in the manner that, that you propose? How would you say that relates to piracy? Or would you not define that as piracy?
To make it sure, I'm a proud pirate. But I would say that the piracy is just, it's a kind of a reaction. It's a result of many crises, and I would say that the biggest one is the institutional one, which is not able to follow their promises. So in that sense, public libraries were not able to do the mission, and then some others would come in, and I would say that was mostly like Amazon and Google. And then at the same time, other services were not there, and that everything kind of, through the recent politics, got regulated only by the market logic. And then, of course, if that's the case, then there is enough of a periphery which would kind of come up with something else. And then in certain kind of context, you will get like a very well articulated piracy, which is politically relevant. And in Europe, you got like Pirate Party, for example. That was disaster, but that's completely other story. So that's the one. And then you have also different kinds of piracies which are happening, for example, in India and in any kind of periphery, which is not only geographical. That periphery is always on so many dimensions. So I would say that piracy is the thing which we should deal with. And I think that we are lucky that we had piracy for the last decades, because it will maybe bring us for the revisiting and renegotiating the foundation of our society, and then see how we will care about the ones who maybe then will not be privileged, because at the moment the ones who kind of entitled to be privileged are not really privileged, but whatever, the profit-driven companies are privileged, not the authors. So let's see how we can address that. And at the moment, I'm more into the labor and whatever, the class struggle. And I wouldn't say that I'm old school. I just think that kind of resonates and provokes in the right way. But others will bring something else. I just think that we need radically revisit that and try to negotiate. And piracy is just a good way to challenge that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm completely overwhelmed by both the talks, and I think it's a disservice that they are back to back. But I have a question which is perhaps trying to bridge the two talks together. And I think in both of the talks, there's a certain fetish of the original, which is kind of making me interested in how you're perceiving an archive. Because while you do talk about a certain post-colonial turn or the loss of a trace, or archives which are collections of annotations and so on, there still seems to be a sacred, sacrosanct, original object that the archive kind of premises itself upon. And I'm very curious about what happens to an archive that does not begin with the original object, right? So if you look at something like older forms of preservation in India, for instance, which look at acts of recension as opposed to acts of preservation, yeah? It means that you have texts which are written and preserved out of originals that never existed. And what would those archives look like? Because then it might allow for maybe moving away from a theory of loss that formulates a fight against and moves us towards a theory of formulation which propels us towards a fight for. And that might be an interesting political strategy as well. I mean, I've known Marcel's work for a long time, and I think the excitement has been in not this fighting merely against, but also fighting for something. And how do you kind of reconcile that? In perhaps a new kind of relationship and negotiation between the text and the user, where you can be romantic about the past without being apologetic about it. But you can also be nostalgic about the future without being blamed of being a romantic. And I'm just trying to straddle the two together.
I don't think that concern for loss is a big part of what I do or what I think. I'm in a sense beating at a straw person here, because a lot of people do talk about archival loss. I love the dissemination of copies. To me, the notion that a film about a rather perhaps ordinary film with extraordinary implications, showing a street in San Francisco just before the earthquake, photographed from a moving cable car, that this has gone into the world maybe in 20 million copies and become kind of an induction for many members of the public into what archivalness might be, into sort of the phenomenology of looking at a piece of evidence that doesn't have a plot, it's just a cable car ride. This is wonderful, and originality, you know, I kept the original in my dining room because seemed like it was safer than the Library of Congress for a while, but you know, we have to stop that. But originality really had nothing to do with it. I definitely think we have to get beyond that. I mean, on the other hand, there is this problem with physical objects, and I stand by the notion that there's a kind of gentrification going on. It's a neoliberal impulse to build digital libraries and, as you mentioned, internet cafes. And it's a class-based, and I think it's an ethnically based crime to decide that new Americans aren't interested in documents of older American cultures and therefore shouldn't see them in libraries. And this is what we're seeing all over the place. So I don't know if that clarifies, but
It does. Thank you very much.
yeah.
It does.
Yeah, I would like to go again from the perspective of the classification and things like that. I think that I agree that there is a dominance of originality, but I would say that there is also another kind of branch of that, which is about the discrete and analog, and then I think that the discrete is kind of it's unavoidable, at least for me. Maybe I'm just too much in programming and computer science. So in that sense, I would say that even without being obsessed or dominated by originality, we will still end up in a kind of discrete and then build on top of that. And I like to bring the dialectics into that. I like to bring the paradox, the dialectic materialism, again, to provoke. We need more of that. And it was for a while a luxury for thinkers when we had communism and then socialism to bring that and actually to ask from everybody to, whenever you think dialectically, you need to go with A and non-A and kind of do the synthesis and all of that. And in many ways, especially when Stalin was in charge, there was a terror of dialectic materialism. So I think that also I always, when I talk with the gang around the public library, I kind of tend to say that there is a research layer, and that's the one that was kind of my question, and I didn't just want to open with that the distribution and then research. And in a way, the research is great, it's fun, it's demanding, it's exciting, but at the same time, it's less political. You know, like the playfulness, unfortunately, is not that political. I would like, if anyone has idea, please come. I would like to get there, but I think that the boring stuff, the distribution, the access, the exclusion, inclusion, these are the politics, and that's why we need to deal with that. And I think that that's why we need to do with discrete, original, and all of these boring classifications, but we need to win over these in order to get into the luxury of the new world where we will do more of a research and dialectics.
Already got the mic. Thanks both for the talks. They're really inspiring. I'm really struck by Marcel's kind of calling of the subject of knowledge, which it's pretty rare in universities these days, strangely enough, I guess. It has been for quite a while anyway. I don't hear much of it. But I'm always a bit struck by it because the thing that worries me about it, or that kind of disconcerts me, is that so much that passes for knowledge that I find mostly kind of useless, that gets produced. In terms of writing, right, if we're talking about text and particularly books or articles today, a lot of it I wouldn't care about, and I wouldn't care wasting energy on archiving, maybe, right? And that's a big problem for the university, maybe not one that kind of you can tackle. But what that requires is kind of a politics of knowledge that goes beyond a question of access, right? So of course, it's clear that the archive in that moment of making knowledge accessible is totally important. So that all this work that that the Memory of the World does and so on is super important. And even in a privileged university, I rely on that. But at the same time, if I want a politics of knowledge from that project, I want something more, right? I want something that says I can get access. I also want something, what you described as this sociality that comes from the archive, which is this conversation about the archive and how we work with that and how we relate to that, what counts as knowledge and what we might count as knowledge. I can also see how what you describe as this kind of metadata, kind of harvesting, but also caring, that produces maybe quite messy forms of metadata that allows to relate to that knowledge as part of the puzzle, right? But I also wonder if there's something more in terms of the politics of knowledge. So, for example, do archives have to kind of overcome this being put in this moment of being responsible for distribution, and it becomes a question of production or something more? Do we need to go into this open access publishing debate? Is there something more that where there's kind of moments in the archive that we can pick up to produce a different kind of politics of knowledge. I don't know if there's I feel that there's more kind of strands of politics in there than you've presented today. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate. I guess it also concerns the second talk a bit. Thank you.
I think that that's what happens all the time. I would say. I mean, that's what we do. I mean, like we deal with these problems, and even when there is a huge crisis outside, we still live our comfortable lives. As you said, we are at the like the privileged university in that sense, and then that happens. And I think that. It goes in parallel, and I kind of feel that sometimes we need something to boost from, just to kind of to make a mess, because everything is so messy, and then we need to be reminded that it's messy, and then maybe we'll just deal with that. That's how I I don't think that memory of the world at the moment can actually deal with that, because. We are primarily focused on the tactical, like It's more like kind of a military doctrine at the moment, unfortunately. But it's fun for a while.
I think the military
I'm sorry,
thing.
I didn't. Yeah. That was fun.
I think the military thing is kind of interesting there. I remember one of these moments of surprise at the emptying of archives when working actually at community college. And is that working? And finding all of the Soviet studies material out on the side of the road, and with a sort of, you can take this, and then when you open it up, it being the middle of the Iraq War at the time, and a history of funding resistance movements within Iraq was there. So I think that one of the things that I really loved about your work particularly was this paying attention to the moments of the cut as tactical, and also as a sort of understanding of that, which is so the ease with which we move to cut and the ease with which certain things disappear being the shifting border at which we can practice the politics of archival work and research and interpretation. So I'm just wondering if there are ways in which you observe the cut through methods of archival work. Does that make sense?
I've seen, since I started collecting film about a long time ago, I've seen hundreds of cuts. It's an endemic situation, and there really isn't a system to respond. There's independent librarians and archivists, but there's a weird, kind of food chain. We're sort of at the bottom of it, but it turns out, and this is in part a response to your comments about knowledge, that ephemeral culture is often a tremendous arena for people who, to the extent that they ever practice theory, they do it low theory, the lowest of low theory, and ephemera is quite accessible, and it often exposes certain kinds of contradictions in a very populist way. So that's some of the stuff we've gone for, but basically it's death by 1,000 cuts, I'm afraid. We're not even, we see a lot of unique material that is, Canada is a great example. What's happening under the Harper government, where libraries and archives that are inconvenient are simply being dumped.
Hi, thank you guys so much for your talks. They've been really fascinating, and there's a lot to think through. But I want to come at it from a slightly different angle, which is that the subtitle of this conference is Actions, right? And Marcel, you've been kind of making references to dialectical materialism and communism and things like that. And there's a certain kind of communistic bent, let's say, to some of the work that you discussed. But at the same time, I think Marxism would kind of reject the idea that universalized access to knowledge in and of itself is somehow enough, right? So I guess, I want to ask both of you in certain ways. There are extremes to this, right? So for example, if one takes it to one extreme, why write Marxist texts at all, right? I mean, the action should be sui generis and there's no need for analysis, right? But on the other hand, there's analysis with no action is kind of pointless. So without necessarily, saying like there has to be kind of a, proletarian revolution at the end of the archival practices that you're discussing, I'm kind of wondering, what actions do these archival processes and practices engender? And maybe, for the purposes of discussion, we could, I know these distinctions are kind of blurry, but maybe we could bracket, the sort of notion of producing more discourse being one of the things that they produce in favor of, other actions that you might think come out of this.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that what I know from Marxism that it would end with the access, with the universal access. I would say that discursive, that trying to find another way to look at something was always kind of part of of that, like a meta discourse in that sense. And I like to and again I'm not sure if I would. I think that the Marxist discourse here is good, and when it comes to archives, with the analysis of the material conditions of the production of the labor, all of these, just like the very old school, boring kind of, and I think that it reveals again that we got stuck, that we are in deadlocks. So I don't think that that's the only way to look at that. Absolutely not. But at the same time, I found that poetic enough that I do that more than some others, because that's more of a kind of how we address the status quo, and that's how I feel about it.
What if we simply said that one, and I don't. Well, the verb would be to historicize. Could we historicize the present? We've got a lot of new infrastructure in the world. Could some of that infrastructure carry history? Could history itself be infrastructure? Could we live as historical creatures? People of faith, live as people of faith, and then people in the temporal world at the same time. Sports fans are often deeply historically conscious. Could we historicize with a sense of ambiguity and make that universal? I think in a lot of ways that's where archives are a social force.
In many ways, that's a perfect link to tomorrow morning, which is about structure. So Florian Sprenger and Lisa Parks, thinking precisely these questions of structure and history. And perhaps this is a great place to end as well, because in light of Andrew's question as well, I've been thinking more and more in the ways in which, rather than your drive that one must transmit, was provoking the desire to transmit, which is exactly what's missing in many ways from the question of the archival and the politics. And so I think this is a wonderful time to end. There is wine, there is cheese, yet more wine, yet more cheese. And please join me in thanking our two really wonderful keynote speakers. And see you all tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.